pots. Bring out your pots. Rusty, broken, worn. Bring out your pots. Joe's dad's voice boomed down the narrow streets and alleys of Northampton as they trudged house from house, street to street, flogging their wares. Joe's dad was a tinker. He went from house to house, fixing people's pots, making them all right, because in those days pots were so expensive, people couldn't afford to nip to the supermarket, there weren't supermarkets, and get themselves new pots, so they had to get their pots fixed. And that was Joe's dad's work. So every morning, Joe and his dad would trudge the streets of Northampton, and then Joe would go off to school. Joe, unlike his dad, was very softly spoken, and when put on the spot, he would feel his throat constrict and his palms sweat. He didn't have a booming voice like his dad. He was quiet, like a mouse. Now one day, Joe and his dad were trudging the streets of Northampton. Bring out your pots! Bring out your pots! His dad's voice boomed. Here, I've got some pots for you, mate, cried the woman from the front door. So Joe and his dad went over and they began to haggle and barter. And Joe stood there listening, and as he listened, his eyes began to water. He could feel something at the back of his throat, and his eyes became stingy red. And as he turned to look down the street, he could see a great cloud of black smoke coming towards him. And behind that smoke were fingers of flame. Joe panicked instantly and tugged on his dad's coat. Not now, boy, can't you see I'm busy? But Joe wouldn't give up. He kept tugging and tugging until his dad saw the wall of flame coming towards him. He took his hand and they both fled, leaving his tinker's barrow behind. Soon, everyone else in the street was running. There were streams and streams of people heading up towards a narrow lane of Gold Street. Vast rivers of humanity, bumping and jostling and pushing and shoving and screaming and crying, help, calling out to their loved ones. Eventually, they got to the top of Gold Street and Market Square, and the crowd collectively breathed a sigh of relief until they looked around and saw they were surrounded on every side by buildings made of wood and straw, and the smoke and the flames had followed them up the hill. The crowd in the square panicked. They looked around, screaming and shouting, until they saw in the corner there was one building, Welsh House, that was made of stone. The crowd pounded on the door until eventually it gave way and they surged through. Little Joe was carried with them right the way through the house to the other side. We stood in an open field. There were row upon row of fruit trees. It was Mr. Devaney's orchard. He found the strongest, tallest tree he could and began to climb. He'd lost his dad in the throng and was searching for him, and it wasn't long before he spotted a man with blackened face, red eyes and tears running down his cheeks. Joe knew what he must do. He took in a deep breath and cried, "Dad!" The man looked up and saw his little boy in the tree. He went over and then they met on the ground and gave each other a big hug. They went hand in hand together to safety and Abington. Over time, they rebuilt the barrow and began trudging from house to house, from street to street, flogging their wares, selling their skills. Bring out your pots, bring out your pots, rusty, broken, worn, bring out your pots.